Right, so
No one else joined.
our next presentation is Scott River Watershed Council Fisheries Monitoring Program. All right, the Scott River Watershed Council's Fisheries Monitoring Program is a collaborative initiative between the Scott River Watershed Council and the Quartz Valley Indian Reservation. This program aims to enhance ongoing efforts to document juvenile and adult coho salmon populations within the Scott River and its tributaries. By integrating with broader monitoring and research efforts throughout the basin, this work provides critical data to inform fisheries and water management decisions while guiding future habitat restoration activities. Key components of the monitoring program include spawning surveys conducted to assess the abundance, distribution, and habitat use of adult salmon during their spawning migration. Juvenile direct observation. Snorkel surveys and other visual assessments methods help track juvenile salmon presence, distribution, and habitat preferences. Passive integrated transponder tagging. Utilizing PIT tags to track fish movement, migration patterns, and survival rates, providing valuable insights into population dynamics and environmental influences. This presentation will highlight this integrated effort and how Scott River Watershed Council is working to understand how the restoration efforts are impacting the Scott River coho salmon. Erich Yokel has dedicated over 20 years to natural resource management in western Siskiyou County, with a primary focus on coho salmon conservation, stream habitat restoration, and water quality improvement. Since 2015, he has been an integral part of the Scott River Watershed Council, contributing his expertise to habitat restoration projects, watershed health initiatives, and collaborative conservation efforts. His work supports sustainable ecosystem management and the long-term viability of local fish populations. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Erich Yokel.
Thank you very much, Ethan. I appreciate that. I kind of shanghaied the presentation slightly. I'm not going to strictly focus just on the Scott River Watershed fishery program. I'm going to do a little bit of kind of background, and I really appreciate being able to follow up Morgan because this presentation is almost exclusively on coho salmon, so I'm not going to address a lot of those Chinook issues and steelhead trout. And as always, I'm the one that's standing up here, but really I'm presenting a huge body of work that was done by a massive, impressive team, both in the Watershed Council and then all of the other agencies and collaborators in the Scott River and the Klamath. I need to reference Betsy Stapleton, Jonah Gilmore, Harrison Morrow, and Colton Dixon, our team at the Watershed Council that was paramount for putting all of this together. So I always need to recognize the suite of important groups that both contributed to the funding and the work that is presented here. Without these groups, and most importantly, the landowners of the Scott Valley, because almost all of this work is done on private lands with the permission of those landowners. Without this group, nothing that I present would be known. So here we have on the audience right a map of the Scott River, including in 2016, the last update, the documented range of coho salmon in the Scott. There's approximately 125 stream miles that have documented coho salmon. Anything, you know, a fish swimming through, catching one juvenile, finding a carcass, that puts that area on the map for documentation. Through the work that we're going to present here in the last couple of years, we've actually added more than 5 miles of stream that has documented coho salmon, and that's one of the focuses that I'm going to put is these streams. So, what are the objectives of this Scott River Fishery Monitoring Program? You know, the first objective really is to understand both the distribution and the specific habitat utilization of all life stages of coho salmon in the freshwater environment of the Scott River. So coho salmon, unlike Chinook, have a pretty strict 3-year life cycle. The progeny the adults that returned in 2024 were the progeny of the adults that spawned in 2021, and it's pretty rigid. So that's why, as Morgan was speaking, we fundamentally have 3 different broods of coho salmon. And then that's the spawning, 3 years life cycle, but actually the half of that 3 years, 1.5 years, is spent in freshwater. They say, oh, go spend the whole year in freshwater. No, they spawn in middle of December. Then the actual eggs incubate for almost half a year because the cold water really slows down how fast they incubate. Then the fry emerge in, call it May of the year, 6 months after they spawn. And then the fry and the juveniles have to spend an entire year in the freshwater. They got to make it through summer, low flows, low habitat volume, relatively warm temperatures, and then they have to make it through winter. Almost the exact opposite. Cold temperatures, high flows, and so really, everybody's like, oh, we're just talking about one species. But this species, because it spends so much of its life and has, in these different life stages, spawning, incubation, summer rearing, winter rearing, it really kind of tests the waters, if you will, of the Scott during all seasons. So it is kind of a very good indicator of the condition of the watershed. So we focus, as I kind of said, on adult spawning and juvenile rearing, and specifically juvenile rearing during summer and winter. And then, most importantly, I really believe is we utilize this monitoring to both, as Morgan spoke to, identify the trends. But here we're really trying to look at where the fish are making a living during these different seasons. It's not just the Scott River, we're looking at French Creek, South Fork Scott River, Kidder Creek. So this allows us, when we identify the presence of a population in these tributaries, to really advise management decisions and direct restoration and protection programs. And then finally, and something that I'll touch upon as we go through this presentation, the results of this monitoring effort has really directed our design, location, and implementation of projects. So next, I'm going to charge. Okay, so here's kind of the 3 major monitoring protocols that we utilize and the timing of them. The adult coho spawning ground surveys, as Morgan said, generally the fish come here around Thanksgiving, and I call them Christmas fish. They're green and red, good Christmas colors. And so it's generally spawning ground surveys are from Thanksgiving to after the New Year. And then we do direct observation surveys where we snorkel and look for the fish in their habitat during the summer base flow period. We've tried to do direct observation surveys during the winter period, and it's almost impossible. The fish are hiding, there's too much water. But summer base flow period, direct observation surveys, and then the juvenile fish sampling, where we use the pit tags. We do that from summer and early fall base flow period into and through the winter runoff periods. Okay, so I'm going to start with the fish, and so the first thing we do, which we completed, it's not that much more than a month and a half ago that we finished these surveys, And the report is almost done. And the adult coho spawning ground surveys. And this is one of the more important pieces of work that we did, because actually in the Scott River, we started doing these surveys cooperatively and voluntarily in 2001. 6 years before the department established the measuring facility. And 2001 was that very strong brood year that was decimated in the 2013 drought. I'm going to speak more to that later. But we just had an immense amount of coho salmon in the Scott River in 01. Sue Maurer, the Forest Service, put together this cooperative effort, and a bunch of volunteers, myself included, went out and chased after fish. And lo and behold, if you go and look for them, you might find them. If you don't look for them, you won't find them. That's another fundamental thesis of monitoring. One of the things that I would like to stress for all these that haven't had the pleasure of doing an adult coho spawning ground survey is these conditions are generally not ideal. It's literally, it's December 25th and the fish are peaking in their spawning. We should really get somebody out there, and then somebody else told me that's business. As you can see, Shannon, that's relatively good conditions. There's not any anchor ice in the water, but, so as you all understand, these are relatively brutal conditions, and kind of what Morgan was saying, one of the main reasons we don't know a lot about steelhead trout is steelhead trout spawn in January, February, and March, and it's even harder to find those spawns. So one of the main results that we got out of that 2001 effort is we found coho salmon spawning in tributaries that we assumed did not support coho salmon, because a textbook that we all read said that stream, the South Fork Scott River, is not a coho stream. It's too steep. It doesn't have a floodplain. The substrate's too coarse. There's nowhere for them to spawn. We don't have to worry about coho being there. Coho, they're a low gradient, they're a valley fish. They really need floodplain connectivity. That goes back to, they have to make it through winter. Where in the world is a juvenile making a living in the South Fork Scott River during the winter? We don't really know that. But these surveys, again, we looked for them, we found them. Really allowed us to find fish in areas that we didn't believe they were there. And therefore, at the time, the South Fork Bouvier Ranch, historic ranch, was owned by Fruit Grower Supply Company. Fruit Grower Supply Company owned about 2 miles of the South Fork. They were, a timber company making boxes for the citrus, and they didn't really care about the stream too much. They had 2 diversions. Both of the diversions weren't screened. We didn't think they needed to screen because, again, there was no coho there, right? Textbook told us there. The first thing that the RCB did when coho discovered in the South Fork is implement relatively rapid protection programs, and that's fish screens up there at the top. Screen the diversions, relatively simple. And then another relative protection method that was done in the Scott is fencing off streams, cattle exclusion fencing to keep the cattle from destroying the reds and stream banks. So there's a really good example of go and look for fish and find them, and then it's like, oh, now we need to do some protection to help protect the fish. And then, after we do the very, very basic protection, these also direct, enhancement efforts. For example, one of the things that we found in tributaries like French Creek is there's very little suitable spawning ground habitat. That's one of the basic limiting factors at the very beginning. There's very little places for the adults to spawn. So, we can just bring in gravel. We bring in gravel and the fish utilize it. And then ultimately, restoration efforts trying to just make more habitat for them. So. Oh, yeah, okay. So I'm gonna go a little bit focus now on some of the design and restoration work that the Watershed Council has been doing in the last several years. This is a project that's being funded by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Again, as I mentioned before, the Bouvet Ranch is now owned by the Thamer family, and they have been gracious enough to allow us to embark on kind of a comprehensive property-wide planning project to try to look for opportunities across the landscape, but especially in the stream. And this property has had some existing restoration, and that's the kind of that half-mile reach that has the yellow squares. And here we have kind of two representative examples. The top is kind of showing you the existing condition of that stream. You can kind of see it's all shallow. There's, you know, not that much wood. And then on the bottom, there's the restoration project that was installed, I think 2022, where the Chow Chow and the RCD installed nice large wood structures, really breaking up that habitat, making deeper water. And so here is kind of where we're going. Now I want to kind of speak, and this might answer some of the questions, and Morgan touched upon this, and this is all using data from the county facility that Morgan spoke to. And one of the big things is when we started doing those surveys in 2001, like I said, we saw a huge amount of fish in 2001. Then we went back in 2002, saw nothing, literally nothing. Went back in 2003, saw nothing. 2004, fish showed back up again. So, and then 2007, when the county facility was put in, and this top graph shows you, we finally saw the actual numbers of what was going on. We had more than an order of magnitude difference between that strong brood year and the two very weak brood years. And then, as you can see, the bottom one is Morgan already showed you the whole trend. So here's two unfortunate and fortunate trends of the two different brood years. Brood year one, as I call it, being the strong brood year, as we spoke to, hit in 2013, and fundamentally it was 2013 when they spawned, and 2014 when they were rearing. That population was decimated from being almost 3,000 animals to the next generation 200 animals. And unfortunately, that population hasn't increased greatly. I really think because you can see from 2016 to 2019, it was going upward, and it was following that trend that we can see in brood year 3. But then the 2019 adults, their progeny juveniles, were rearing in the summer of 2020. Again, another catastrophic drought. And so that's really kind of the take home of these catastrophic droughts that are really, outside largely of our control, can have a massive effect on the population of coho salmon and all other aquatic species potentially. Conversely, brood year 3 gives a much better story. You can see, 2009, we're less than 100 animals, and now 2021, this is the population that returned in 2024. Morgan said, I believe it's about 1,000 animals. We can still see that trend going upwards. So that's very nice. So now I'm going to specifically speak to the last 2 years of coho spawning surveys. The first one being 2023, 2024. These again were funded by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. In 2023, 2024, we did a cooperative effort with the Siskiyou RCD, Torres Valley Indian Reservation. Here on the left is the training from that. And we had some really good coverage of the Scott River, and also for whatever reason. This was almost like a perfect survey season, and we saw a huge amount of reds, a huge amount of distribution. And here is just the map that shows the the reaches that we surveyed and the red locations. For that question of where we see the most coho reds, traditionally this has been the case, forever. It's in the recovery plans, and French Creek, Sugar Creek, Shackelford, and Mill Creek and Quartz Valley have always been known to support, and they are kind of your more traditional low gradient valley reaches for coho salmon. But also additionally, we see a significant amount of spawning in the East Fork Scott River and Etna Creek. And then some of those more adverse areas like the South Fork Scott River, higher gradient, less floodplain. We do see Upper Kidder Creek is a really good example. Upper Etna Creek, and we're going to speak to that. We see coho utilizing it, just not at the densities that we see in the more valley-defined reaches. So here's just a little kind of similar to Morgan's discussion about the Chinook salmon and the distribution of them relative to canyon or the valley, depending on the flow regime during their timing of migration, which is October. In the past, really with coho salmon, because they migrate more in November, we haven't had very many problems with connectivity and volitional access to their habitats, because usually by the time the coho salmon are coming into the Scott River in mid-November, we've had those fall rains. Everything's connected. It's just them, going where they want to go. Well, and then 2020. In 2020, we really had this connectivity in the Scott River and through November into early December. And then finally, I think mid-December, and you can see in the hydrograph, 2020 is actually water year 2021. Tricky hydrologists. It was flat until that little bump in mid-December, and then versus 2023, 2024, we had really good rains in November, December, and there was more volitional. So what we're seeing fundamentally is that this connectivity is potentially kind of affecting the distribution of coho within the Scott Valley. And just this really nice figure that we put together comparing the distribution of reds that were observed in 2020, 2021, that drought year, versus 2023, 2024, an average year. In 2020, 2021, we saw a quarter of the reds in the mainstem Scott River, kind of similar to what happened in 2013, that catastrophic drought year. And so there's the distribution from this past spawning ground survey. We don't have the observations of the RCD on that map, so that just includes the Watershed Council. This past year, we did not, and QBIR, this past year, we did not see as many reds as we did the previous year, which is interesting because the escapement was the same. So here's just a kind of showing, and then another one of our design reaches on the East Fork Scott River at Grouse Creek. And on the left, you have the red distribution in 2023, 2024, and on the right, you have what we saw this past year. So a significant decrease in the same area. And then one of the cool things, like our discovery in 2001 in the South Fork, this past spawning ground survey year, we discovered fish utilizing Noise Valley Creek, tributary to the East Fork, another area where we had not previously documented spawning, thus increasing the upward expand. So here's another example of one of the restoration projects that we've done that is specifically driven by these observations on the Nature Conservancy's property on French Creek, where we put in wood structures and associated gravel to hopefully, give them more areas to spawn, and then for the juveniles, which we're going to talk about right now, to rear. And another project that just wanted to touch upon that we constructed in 2024 with funding from United States Fish and Wildlife Service, BOR, and NCRP is the Sugar Creek Salmon Refugia project, where we literally constructed a channel in which the fish spawned. And then downstream of that constructed channel, we have a slow water rearing habitat for the juvenile fish that emerge from those reds to rearing in Sugar Creek. So the next thing, here's the one picture that doesn't come out of the Watershed Council's project, but I had to include it because it's so cool, is direct observation surveys. And fundamentally, this is one of the biggest tools that we can use to literally see the habitats where the fish are making a living. And specifically the juvenile fish, but here we can also see that the juvenile and adults are enjoying the same habitats. During our direct observation surveys, we also look for signs of beaver. And one of the major principles of the Watershed Council is protecting beaver habitat. One of the non-single species parts of my speech. Everybody knows, because you can see them from the surface when you're nice and high and dry, the beaver dams and the obvious benefits to habitat those beaver dams make. But also here, an example is a beaver den submerged that you're not going to be able to see unless you're swimming underwater, and nice habitat for fish to hide in. So I'm going to go back to another principle. Like I said, is here's a map on the left, as you can see, of the number of juvenile coho salmon that we observed in that reach of the East Fork around Grouse Creek. And then we utilized those locations to try to target where we wanted to put our temperature monitoring data. Because we figured, okay, these fish, like for example, that one area where there's 120 juvenile coho in a pool, is that pool any cooler? So then we put temperature devices in these locations to try to see if there was cold water inputs where these fish were utilizing, because if we had cold water inputs, then that would be important in our design to do something that potentially could protect or enhance those cold water habitats. That's an interesting. I spent half an hour, an hour trying to find a good picture of Upper Etna Creek. So I have the illustrative photo of Etna Creek goes here. So we documented adult spawning and juvenile rearing significantly above where it was previously documented in Etna Creek. And one of the major things that we've seen is that generally we have juvenile rearing upstream of adult spawning. We have another project that's at the confluence of Etna Creek with the Scott River. This is one of the reaches in the Scott River where we have both Chinook and coho spawning. And on that same point of juveniles being found significantly above where we've documented adult spawning is in Boulder Creek, a tributary to the South Fork. We've seen documented juvenile salmon up to a mile above the confluence and where we suspect the coho are spawning. So these juveniles are swimming up into these cold waters, and this is really habitat that's more conducive to the Pacific giant salamanders. Finally, I went over time, which is pretty typical for me. The final component of this, and I'm going to go through it really fast, but I want to give some credit to it because it's a major component of our work, is marking recapture sampling with pit tags. And Harrison Morrow is currently working with UC Davis, getting his master's thesis, looking at differences in beaver dam analog habitats, like up there on the left, and versus control habitats or untreated habitats, and trying to see how these are affecting the productivity, the growth, and survival of juvenile cove salmon. And those are really what we can get from these juvenile habitat is, in the condition, the growth, movement. Because when we put a pit tag in it, we can detect those pit tags using stationary antennas like what you see up there, and ultimately survival, which we work with. So here's just kind of showing illustratively, relatively, you go in and your population, we measure them by length, fork length, and you have this assemblage of, from the big fish to the small fish. And I'm not trying to be tricky. All these photos were taken pretty much at the same time. And we've sampled in different locations and we've seen fundamentally different average size of fish in those locations. And ultimately we hope that can tell us something about those different habitats, things that are working, things that aren't working. And then fish moving around. So we have stationary antennas. Oh, I got one down. There we go. So this is the final. We built that slow water habitat in Sugar Creek. You can see it up on the left, and daylighted it in October 25th of 2024, and have those antennas that you can see at the inlet. And this is just indicative. Is we saw around that high flow event on November 22nd, 24, significant amount of juvenile fish moving in from Sugar Creek where they were tagged to this constructed slow water habitat via our antenna. So that's pretty cool. Actually, we saw fish that were tagged more than a mile up in Sugar Creek move down and in to this habitat. And finally, by doing this year over year, we are actually getting adult returns of pit tagged fish that we tagged previously as juveniles. So this past year, we had 15 pit tagged adult coves and detected in the Scott River Watershed Council. And Betsy Stapleton has spent a lot of time with a huge suite of collaborators developing this Climate Basin Fisheries Collaborative. And, the fundamental goal is to all of the groups within the Klamath, especially now that the dams are removed, collaborate to kind of track our pit tags because it can become, and then, as I said, I'm over time, but I appreciate it.